If you're stuck doing 3 sets of 10, 5 by 5, or any other boring straight set configuration for your strength training, you're in for a real treat with this video. You're going to learn every nuanced piece of information for implementing cluster sets within your training. And it's going to cover everything from what, when, why, and how, and then examples that you can use today within your own strength training to maximize strength, speed, and power. And of course, make sure you check out the first links in the description. The conditioning mentorship is up and running. Check that out. 7-day free trial on the Sweet Science Fighting Training app. And of course, the Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, and MMA strength conditioning blueprints, they are free and they are down there. So let's go straight into cluster sets. And what the hell are cluster sets? It's a way to vary the rest distribution within a set. So if you think about a traditional set structure, like I mentioned earlier, for example, 5 by 5, you're gonna do all 5 reps in that set, then you're gonna rest, and you're gonna perform the next set. Within a cluster set structure, you're gonna have rest within the set itself, or between the reps, as well as after the set. So take the example of doing a set of 5. Instead of doing all 5 reps in a row, you might do 1 rep, rest 20 to 30 seconds, do another rep, rest 20 to 30 seconds until you hit all 5 reps in that set. Then you rest like you would between sets and continue on. But it doesn't just have to be 1 rep and then rest. You can do sets of 2, sets of 3, even sets of 5 before taking a rest within the set and doing the next cluster of reps. Now, rest times between these reps or cluster of reps typically ranges from 10 to 30 plus seconds. In my experience, 30 seconds is the sweet spot. And that goes for if you're doing 1 rep or 2 reps or even 3 reps. I typically don't like to do clusters greater than 3 reps. Even 3 reps, I typically won't do a cluster, and I'll usually stick to 1 or 2 reps as part of the cluster set structure. Now, you can go slightly less rest. So if you're doing, say, singles, so 1 rep, 1 rep, 1 rep, you could do 10 to 20 seconds of rest. And if you're doing, say, 2 reps, you could do 20 to 30 seconds of rest. I've just found 30 seconds works really well on all of them. And especially when you don't realize how much time it takes to re-rack the bar, or depending on what you're doing, adding more, taking weights off or adding more weights, etc. between sets. So now you know the difference of what a cluster set is versus a traditional straight set. But what makes a cluster set unique and why even use it at all? The first one is to maintain rep quality. And when we talk about rep quality, we're typically just talking about the velocity of the rep. Since if we're moving the same weight faster, it means we're producing more power. And ideally, this kind of overload over time would lead to better strength, size, power gains, which I'm going to come to in a bit after this section, because that may not be the case. But within a traditional set structure, we see a decline in velocity throughout the set. If you look at the velocity loss research, and even from your own experience performing a rep, reps slow down as you fatigue. By taking rest between reps, you don't have that same slowdown. So if we look at this study here, where they compared traditional sets of bench press, which they use 4 sets of 5 at 85% 1RM, and then use the same protocol, but with 30 seconds rest between reps, they found the cluster set group were better able to maintain average velocity for the set, meaning they were just able to move each rep faster on average throughout the set versus the group that just did 5 reps straight. We also see the same maintenance of rep velocity during the squat when they're doing 3 sets of 10 at 10 RM versus having 15 or 30 seconds rest between those reps. Even breaking up sets of 10 during the squat at 70% 1RM into 2 clusters of 5 reps with 30 seconds rest has shown to maintain higher rep velocities in the last 5 reps compared to performing all 10 in a row, which if you think about kind of common sense, you're getting a little bit of rest, you're able to recover a little bit and then perform the final reps at a much higher quality and a much higher speed. And as you can expect, placing a 30-second rest every 2 reps instead of every 4 to 5 reps attenuates that decline in set velocity to an even greater extent, which you can imagine. Taking more rest between less reps is going to help you reduce fatigue. And what you'll find is greater average forces, total work, and greater time under tension without the reduction in velocity or peak power compared to traditional cluster sets. And then when we look at more ballistic style movements like Olympic weightlifting, we see the cluster set configuration with the clean pull exhibits greater barbell velocities by 8% and greater peak power by 6% compared to a traditional set group. So overall, we can take from this body of research, cluster sets just allow you to better maintain rep quality, i.e. bar speed, than traditional set structures. Now, in line with this, along the idea of being able to maintain better rep qualities and reduce that fatigue, is this idea of being able to do more volume, and we could call it even more effective volume. So interesting study that compared traditional versus cluster sets during the back squat at their individual optimal power load, which is essentially the load that maximizes power output during that lift. The traditional set group, they performed 6 sets of as many reps as possible until average power dropped below 90% for 2 consecutive reps. So it was basically a power drop off. They had to try and maintain that peak power output all the way through. Then as soon as that performance dropped by 10% for a couple of reps, the set terminated. Now the cluster set group did the same thing, but they did it in clusters of 2 reps. So instead of just doing continuous reps, trying to hit that number, they did 2 reps, rested 20 seconds, 2 reps, rested 20 seconds until that power dropped below 90%. And they found that the cluster set group performs more reps above 90% average power and more reps in total by approximately 1.6 times the number of reps compared to the traditional set group. So you're able to perform more effective volume at these loads. And then we have this brand spanking new paper where they compare traditional versus cluster sets during high volume power cleans. Now, no one's gonna really program high volume power cleans, but still it's an interesting look into the effects of cluster sets. So 3 sets of 9 at 70% 1RM versus 3 sets of 9 with 30 seconds rest between reps. They found that peak velocity declined across all the reps in the traditional set, but remained stable in the cluster set, which again, comes back to common sense when we're taking rest between reps. What was interesting as well is that the traditional set saw progressive changes in barbell trajectory during the pull phase compared to the cluster set, leading to greater forward displacement. So essentially technique from fatigue just got wonky. So if you're doing higher volumes, cluster sets can allow you to preserve technique better, especially during more technical movements like the Olympic lifts. The third reason for cluster sets, which I've kind of touched on already, is this idea of reducing fatigue. And we've talked about how you're able to maintain better rep velocity, which is an indicator of reducing fatigue. But this study here has shown that doing 3 sets of 10 as straight sets resulted in greater perceived mechanical and metabolic fatigue compared to doing in cluster set structures. And by reducing fatigue and having better rep velocities and better rep quality, the final benefit is that we can ideally or likely improve peak power and velocity. And in my opinion, this is where cluster sets work best. And that's not to say it doesn't work elsewhere, but with ballistic movements. And when you look in the research, a lot of the research only shows differences in cluster sets versus traditional sets when we're looking at ballistic movements instead of traditional strength movements. Now there's a reason for this, I'm gonna come to that in a second. But when performing 6 sets of 6 vertical jumps with 20% 1RM, the cluster set group, who had a 30-second rest every 2 reps, improved peak power by 10% and velocity by 8% after a very short 3-week intervention, where the traditional set group only improved by 3% and 2% respectively. Jump velocity was maintained through the cluster set protocol, while the traditional set group saw a 4% decline. Now, what's interesting is when we look at traditional strength training exercises being used in this, and there's an interesting new paper here that actually took individual force velocity profiles from these athletes in the squat and bench and looked at the changes of this individual force velocity profile over an intervention of cluster sets versus straight sets. And if you're not familiar with force velocity profiling, they're essentially taking data points along a line and they're extrapolating out either end, and you're able to mathematically calculate essentially their peak force at 0 velocity and then their peak velocity at 0 load. So what they did is they had the traditional set group, they performed 4 sets of 8, while the cluster set group performed 16 sets of 2 with 1 minute rest between sets, all at a 10 rep max. They found both training groups increased 1RM similarly in the squat and bench, but the squat cluster group shifted their force velocity profile, which you can see in this graph here, more toward a velocity profile, whereas the traditional set group didn't, which is an interesting finding because typically we see in the research that cluster sets are not superior to traditional strength training. And why is that? Why can you do multiple sets with high velocities, higher powers, better rep quality, but still not see better improvements typically in strength, size, and power compared to a traditional set group? And I'll give you some examples. This 2021 meta-analysis by Davies and colleagues, they state both set configurations, clusters and traditional, demonstrate equal effectiveness to positively induce muscular and neuromuscular adaptation. We can even go to an earlier review by the legend Greg Huff. You can watch him on the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. They actually talk about cluster sets too. Noted that cluster sets may be more useful for explosive power development, while traditional set structures may be better for strength and hypertrophy development. And if you look at the velocity loss research, that kind of makes sense because you need some velocity loss of fatigue to maximize strength development and also to maximize muscle size development. So just from these, even though we're able to better maintain rep velocity and power over a set, it doesn't seem to translate into increased strength and size gains more than traditional sets. And we can even go back to our first bench press paper that I mentioned earlier, where similar increases in 1RM bench press were seen between cluster and traditional sets, and even in that force velocity profiling paper, where similar increases in 1RM strength were seen. However, there's one methodological flaw. Many of these cluster set papers miss And I understand why. They kind of have to, because they have to match the training load between the groups. So if you're doing 4 sets of 5 at 85% 1RM, you have to do the exact same training load in the other group to be able to compare the differences. But cluster sets are unique where they allow you to exceed the loads lifted for a given number of reps. So for example, take 90% of your 1RM. That would be considered a 3 rep max. So you could do 1 set of 3 as a traditional set structure at this weight. But if you split that into a cluster set configuration, you could do a set of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 with rest in between. That will give you 4 reps at your 3 RM. Now you can see why cluster sets can be an absolute potent strength training stimulus on top of being a very potent ballistic and power-based stimulus. And this is where the real magic happens within cluster sets. So let me give you some practical examples, some practical set configurations you can take and you can start using within your own training. And let's just start with traditional cluster sets. Very simple, probably the best place to start, the easiest way to implement these. And it's pretty much gonna be the bread and butter of your cluster set training. My go-to traditional cluster sets are typically using doubles. So 2 reps, 2 plus 2 plus 2, with 30 seconds rest in between. I use this extensively within the Sweet Science of Fighting training app with different jumps and even with the lifts themselves. Here's how a 4-week cycle could look. This is just an example to give you an idea of how it could be overloaded. So week 1, 3 sets of 2 plus 2 plus 2 with 30 seconds rest in between at 75% 1RM. Now this is quite light. So this is just to get you used to the idea of using cluster sets, the timing, all that kind of stuff. The second week, same thing, but you can bump it up to 80% 1RM. Now you're getting closer to a 6 RM. 80% 1RM is around an 8 rep max. So you're not quite pushing those limits yet, but you're getting close and you're getting relatively heavy. Week 3 is when you start the overload. Same thing, but you're doing it at 85% 1RM, which would be considered a 5 rep max. Depending on the chart you're looking at, I use it as a 5 rep max. So now you're doing 6 reps at your 5 rep max. And if anyone who's ever done, say, a squat of 2 plus 2 plus 2 at 85% 1RM, it is brutal. It is really brutal, but that's what makes it so potent. Then you could go week 4 if you want to go a little further, and you can go 3 sets of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 at your 90% 1RM with your 30 seconds rest in between. And that will give you 2 weeks of really heavy overload. I also love to do these with jumps. If you're doing like a barbell jump squat or a trap bar jump with 30 to 45% 1RM, or even just like 10% body weight in your hands holding dumbbells, you can do the same thing, 2 sets of 2 plus 2 plus 2, so you can maximize the effectiveness of those jumps. You get 6 jumps in a set without any of the fatigue. So let's go to the second practical set structure. This one, most of you probably won't use. It is very advanced, way more intense than the current ones I just gave you. Even doing 4 reps at 90% 1RM, this is far more intense. That is accentuated eccentric loading clusters. And we've talked about eccentric loading a lot on this channel. This one is pretty brutal and probably doesn't fit into a lot of training schedules, and you need the equipment to do it. But the idea is that you are stronger eccentrically than you are concentrically. So if we can load the eccentric phase heavier, we can potentially potentiate the concentric portion of that lift. So if I'm able to go heavier down, that should feel lighter on the way up, and I should be able to move faster on the way up. Doesn't always happen within the research, but that's the general idea. But then obviously you are adding an eccentric overload component to get the adaptations from eccentric training. So this paper here, they took 3 sets of 5 at 80% 1RM, and they added 105% 1RM for the eccentric phase. So essentially weight releases on the bar, 105% 1RM going down, the weights come off, 80% on the way up, and then they would add it back on for every rep for the set of 5. So you're essentially doing 5 eccentric overload reps in that one set. Pretty brutal. But resulted in greater eccentric work, greater rate of force development, and velocity compared to the traditional loading, which you can kind of understand considering you're literally just putting the most intense stimulus on these subjects, and it's probably a novel stimulus too. So let's go to my 2 favorite cluster set loading structures that are a little more advanced, but work best with ballistic style movement and typically with Olympic weightlifting. So weightlifting derivatives, power snatches off blocks, snatch pulls, clean pulls, all that kind of stuff. This is where I think these all work best, but you can still use these structures with traditional strength training as well. The first one is an ascending wave cluster. And this is geared to more towards your heavy strength development. So your heavier cleans and snatches, or just your heavier squats and bench, etc. And it's almost like your typical wave loading, where if you're familiar with wave loading, you might do a set of 8, then the next set is a set of 6, the next set is a set of 4, and then you come back and you do a set of 8, 6, 4, and that's like 6 sets. But this wave is actually within the set itself. So if you zoom out, the set structure will be 3 sets of 3. But if you zoom in, the loading structure within it is pretty cool. So here's an example, set 1. You're gonna do 1 rep at 80%, 1 rep at 83%, 1 rep at 86% 1RM. You're gonna have 30 seconds rest between these reps. Once you finish those 3, then you're gonna rest your typical 2, 3, 4 minutes. Set 2, you start at 83%, 86%, 89%, rest. Set 3, 86%, 89%, 92%. What's really nice about this cluster set structure is the first rep of each set feels really light, because obviously you've exceeded that already and you've already touched the weight. So when you come back to it, it feels really good and snappy. So you almost get this potentiation effect during the start of each wave. My other favorite, which is very similar to this, is the pyramid set structure. And you might be familiar with pyramid sets if, for example, maybe you've gone down the bodybuilding rabbit hole where bodybuilders may pyramid their reps over a set, maybe working up to a heavier load with less reps, then kind of backing off on the way down and doing higher reps. For this one in particular, you're doing with load, but the reps stay the same. So if you were to perform a cluster pyramid set of 5 reps, you would do something like 80%, 83%, 86%, 83%, 80%, all with 30 seconds rest in between reps. Now, I've only ever seen this used within Olympic weightlifting, specifically with the super heavyweight, weighs 160 to 180 kgs, and it was more of a conditioning stimulus because he would have to often follow himself on the platform. So if you think about being that big and heavy and having to max out snatches and cleans, but only having around 2 minutes rest in between, if that, you need to be really good at being able to take multiple maximal attempts. So this pyramid style is a way to do some form of, I guess you could say, barbell or weightlifting conditioning within the lifts themselves. But it has application outside of that because you're able to use this as a way to maximize speed and power development and strength development within this cluster set configuration, since you have rest in between. And as you come back down this pyramid, it's almost like a potentiation effect because you've already hit that top ceiling number. Everything else feels light after that. We then have hypertrophy cluster sets. Now, this is more of I'm gonna say a controversial-ish one because I don't think these are really cluster sets, but they get classed as cluster sets or hypertrophy cluster sets. They work quite well, but technically I wouldn't class them as a cluster set, but I'm gonna add them anyway. So this original 2013 study, they looked at a cluster set protocol of 8 sets of 5 between 65 to 75% 1RM with 30 seconds rest over 12 weeks. And they found that it induced similar muscle growth compared to traditional sets. Now, what was interesting is the cluster set group also improves bench press and squat 1RM, power, and vertical jump to a greater extent than a traditional set group. But again, to call these clusters just because there's 60 seconds rest in between is a little borderline. So if we look at this 2021 study, they used a more traditionally defined cluster. The groups performed 4 sets of 5 at 85% 1RM of the bench press, or they performed those with 30 seconds rest in between each rep as a cluster for 8 weeks, and they saw the opposite results. They saw the traditional set group show greater muscle growth and the pecs with similar increases in strength. And they also put this down to a greater velocity loss of the traditional set group, resulting in greater fatigue and hypertrophy outcomes, which we see in the velocity loss research. I've done a whole video on this, where to maximize hypertrophy, you're looking at a 40 to 50% velocity loss in the set. If you're maximizing strength, you're looking at about 20%. And if you're trying to maximize power development, speed and power development, you're looking at like up to 10%. So you need this kind of fatigue if you're looking to maximize hypertrophy outcomes. And that's why cluster sets typically don't fit into that model for hypertrophy. And then the final cluster set configuration I want to cover with you is high volume power training. I've done an entire video on this too, but I'm gonna give you a quick breakdown. The name kind of explains it itself. High volumes of power-based movements. Now that paper I referenced earlier in the video around high volume power cleans where they did 3 sets of 9 could be an example of this high volume power training. But typically you do this with movements that are relatively easy to do. Typically jumps or loaded jumps in this instance. You could do it with various weightlifting derivatives like pulls and even speed squats, but the ballistic movements are always going to be more effective for stuff like this. So you're typically looking at your optimal power load, which for say a jump squat, you're looking at 30 to 40, 45% of your squat 1RM that you're going to jump with. Same thing with the trap bar deadlift, you're going to do trap bar jumps. Or if you're going to do weightlifting derivatives, 60 to 75% of your power clean 1RM would also fit. 2 to 3 sessions per week, and you're looking at anywhere from 12 to 20 reps per set, and anywhere from 90 to 200 reps per session. Hence the term high volume power training. Now, Alex Natera made this, I guess you could say relatively famous many years ago, and I've done it myself. It is brutal. So if you're doing something like this would take place of your other conditioning. So if you're typically doing, say, sprint intervals or other stuff, this would be your conditioning essentially in the gym. So how does it look in practice? Well, this paper here by Schuster and his colleagues has a really good little 3-week outline for you. I'm gonna put this on the screen. I'm not gonna read it out because it's gonna take way too long, but essentially you're just doing clusters of 5 reps initially, and then next week you're doing sets of 12 in the jumps, and the final week you're doing sets of 10, but you're just doing a shit ton more volume, and the rest decreases as well. Now, before you go taking all this and throwing cluster sets into your training, Just understand some of these limitations first. The first one is time. This is the main drawback of cluster sets. When you're talking rest redistribution as a training modality, typically you're taking the rest that you'd use at the end of the sets and distributing it across all your reps. With the cluster set, you still have that rest at the end of your set, but you're also adding rest within the set. So you're just adding more time. So it's just something to be aware of. You may need to modify some of your program. If you're short on time, you may only be doing one lift, or if you're short on time, you may not do these at all. And to give you an example of rest redistribution versus cluster sets, you could take 4 sets of 6 with 90-second rest between sets. And a rest redistribution configuration would be 4 series of 3 sets of 2 with 15 seconds rest between the 2 reps and 30 seconds between the sets. Hopefully that makes sense, because some of these configurations can kind of look a little funky, but basically every time you do 2 reps, you take 15 seconds rest. Once you finish your 3 sets of 2, you take a 30-second rest and you do 4 rounds of that. That would be like a rest redistribution model. That is still very, very effective, but it is a way where you're able to take the same time frames and put it into a cluster set configuration instead of adding more rest. And that's everything you need to know about cluster sets. And I wish I had another video to point you to that would be something along those lines, but maybe I'll send you here, because this one will break down eccentric training for speed, strength, and power, and how you can also implement that too within your training.